Welcome back, everyone, to the fifth and final episode of my reaction to 30 Years War by Extra History. This was a reaction series that was specifically requested by our patrons who voted on it. I'm also putting up a new vote for all patrons at all levels. So after you've done watching this video, if you are one of our patrons and you haven't already done so, let me know your feedback on what you'd like to see next. We will be, from time to time, also posting some polls here on YouTube for all viewers and subscribers, regardless of whether or not you're able to support on Patreon. But I want to thank everyone for their continued support. I am off to Kansas today for my first event with my day job, Rachel's Challenge, in a year and a half. So I'm excited about that, and I'll be back Wednesday night, so I'll be back to recording videos again on Thursday. But you can be watching on Wednesday for our next episode in the series on the Battle of Vicksburg from my visit there a few weeks ago. I'm going to finish up that editing in the hotel tonight. You should see it tomorrow. Let's dive in to episode 5.
(1643) Westphalia. Representatives gather. Diplomats of the Holy Roman Empire, of Spain, of Sweden and Denmark, of Bavaria and Brandenburg. After years of negotiation, political and religious argument, and bartering, they finally seek to end the most destructive war Europe has ever seen.
Now, he mentioned some of the big players in this conference that would lead to the Treaty of Westphalia. There were over 100 parties in this. I mean, think about trying to negotiate a settlement among over 100 separate parties representing a bunch of interests, a bunch of factions, a bunch of sides, religions, politics, all of this stuff. I mean, it's amazing that anything substantial came out of this.
A war that through plague, massacre, and famine has almost become a force in itself. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the keys of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up. And a seal set upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, when he would be unleashed again.
So that, once again, is a reference to the book of Revelation, which is in the end of the Bible, and this idea of this being the end times, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are then followed up by, there's a bunch of seals and trumpets, and there's all these judgments of God that are unleashed upon the earth, but then the dragon, Satan, is bound and he's cast into a pit for 1,000 years, and peace is brought to the earth. And again, depending on your theology, some people believe this is something that has already happened. Many more people believe it's something that is yet to happen. But at this time, it's very easy for people to have believed that it was happening in their midst because of all the destruction they were seeing in Europe at this time.
Thanks so much to HelloFresh for helping to bring this episode to the table. A kingdom shattered, millions dead, and an endless conflict draining the finances and manpower of all who took part. How to put the demon back in the bottle. As long as the 30 Years' War remained a conflict centered on religion, it was a difficult thing to resolve. After all, the parties believed that as far as spiritual matters were concerned, there was an immutable right and wrong. Orthodoxy and heresy with little room for accommodation.
So yeah, if you're sticking to this being a conflict about faith, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, and then even within the Protestants, you have Calvinists, you have others, Lutherans. If that's the sticking point, there's no room for compromise there. I mean, if you believe that this is the right way of exercising your faith, you're not going to compromise on that. You can compromise on national borders. You can compromise on political ideas. You can compromise on how things should be structured, but you're not going to compromise on religion. So you've got to reframe the purpose of this war, reframe your aims in settlement so that it's not about religion.
Even those who fought primarily for money or power had to cloak their motives in religion, making political compromise difficult, especially when external forces like the Catholic Church or larger Protestant neighborhoods had their say. But nearly 2 decades into the conflict, that started to break down. In 1634, representatives of Emperor Ferdinand and the Protestant state of Saxony met at Prague Castle to try and resolve the religious and political questions that had originally torn apart the Holy Roman Empire. And they actually hammered out a deal most imperial states could accept. Emperor Ferdinand agreed to walk back his counter-Reformation campaign, where he tried to stamp out Lutheranism and restore the religious map as it had been at the Peace of Augsburg. Saxony, in turn, agreed that its army would be part of the larger army of the empire, and that it would no longer make formal alliances with other states of the empire or outside powers. There was also an amnesty for everyone who'd fought against the emperor, apart from the heirs of the now-dead Frederick V.
So these are all important kind of baby steps. I mean, they're not baby steps. These are actually significant settlements that are happening, and these are going to lay the groundwork for larger things to be able to take place.
It was a reasonable peace, and other states of the empire joined in when the agreement went into force in 1635. However, there was a place where it didn't play well: France. Though Catholic and hostile to Protestants within France, King Louis XIII was an avowed enemy of the Habsburgs, and he feared being encircled by Spanish Habsburg territory in Spain, Italy, and the separate Habsburg branch ruling the Holy Roman Empire.
Now, do you see any parallels here between the 1600s and the 1800s and even the 1900s? Because they're there. This is all about balance of power. France, on its own, is a pretty significant power in the world. They've got a large population, they've got a lot of territory, but their concern is being surrounded by enemies in Italy, Spain, what is now Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. So they're looking for something that's going to balance that out so they're not all on their own. This is the exact same thing that you see happening in the 1800s with the Napoleonic Wars, where France becomes this major power and everybody else gangs up on them. In the 1900s, when you see alliances being formed to kind of keep the balance of power. So this is just a precursor to all of that.
And really, a strengthened Holy Roman Empire on his eastern border wasn't really what he wanted to see. So in 1635, he instructed his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, to enter the war on the side of the Protestants and attack Spain. It was a move that changed the entire nature of the war,
now it's not
turning
about
a
religion.
conflict of Protestant and Catholic states into one of pro- and anti-Habsburg factions. And with Spain tied down and the prospect of Protestant victory renewed, Sweden took the opportunity to jump back into the war.
And so this gives them their out when it comes to people saying it's about religion. Because now you can say, well, wait a second, if it's about religion, why are Catholics fighting on the same side as Protestants? You can't argue it's about religion anymore. This actually, even though this kind of raises the tension level, because now you've got France and Sweden in this conflict, and these are two major powers, it actually is what's going to lead to them having a way out of this whole mess.
But it was different this time. There was an end goal in sight. Grab enough territory to come to the negotiating table, and hopefully build on the Peace of Prague in order to achieve political goals. The tide swung in the anti-Habsburg faction's favor in 1640. And in 1641, Cardinal Richelieu was entertaining Habsburg envoys who tried to make a separate peace with France, but Richelieu insisted that all the allies must come to peace at the same time. And after a bit of wrangling, they decided on a place: the state of Westphalia. There they declared that two cities were to be exempt from the raging war to serve as negotiating centers: the Lutheran-controlled city of Münster and the universally Catholic Osnabrück, where they started to work on a treaty that would reshape Europe, even as the war continued to rage around them. But don't start imagining the United Nations here. You know, like with everybody in the same big room. This is still the 17th century, after all, where communications and travel are incredibly slow, people get sick, and ambassadors have to wait for orders. The first delegations arrived in 1643.
And this is something that happens throughout history at this time, where you have people that go there, but communication's so slow. You know, you're talking weeks to send and receive orders and instructions. This happened during the American Revolution when they were trying to work on independence. The reason that the state of New York actually abstains on the final vote of independence is because they were still waiting for new instructions from New York about how they were allowed to vote. So even though they were a representative, they didn't have the autonomy to be able to just vote however they wanted to. They had to represent specific instructions. So you have that here too. So it's a long process waiting, and when we're dealing with, like I said, over 100 parties to this whole thing, that's a lot of people waiting to send and receive messages to find out how they're allowed to proceed.
And various ambassadors from major nations like France, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain, plus representatives of small states in the Holy Roman Empire, just sort of filtered through for the next 6 years, trying to create a compromise everyone would accept. There were even side treaties. Spain and the Dutch Republic, for instance, ended the 80 Years' War, which had merged with the 30 Years' War, with Spain formally recognizing Dutch independence, but also winning religious tolerance for Dutch Catholics. And those same questions about religion fed into the other treaties made at Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War. The agreement went by one simple principle: who rules his religion? No, you heard me right. After millions dead and decades of compounding misery, we are right back at the Peace of Augsburg. Glad we all did that, right, everybody?
So it kind of sucks if you think about it. They fought this 30 Years' War, going on 5 to 10 million people dead, just to change nothing, really. I mean, in the big picture, nothing, but there were some things that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia that had long-term impact.
Okay, to be fair, there were a few key differences. Now, in addition to Catholic or Lutheran, rulers could choose to be Calvinist. And members of minority religions were free to practice in private or even in public during certain times allowed by the state. Hereditary Habsburg lands were exempt, however. They would be Catholic. But there were two even more difficult questions. How would the Holy Roman Empire's constitution change? And who would get the land that had changed hands? And here's where the war comes into the picture. Because as the negotiations dragged on, the war tilted in favor of the anti-Habsburg faction. By 1648, Protestant armies were marching back into Prague Castle, marking the last major battle of the war and leaving the Imperial Spanish faction not much to negotiate with. Ferdinand III, son of the now dead Ferdinand II, was forced to give up much of the centralized power his father had seized, strengthening the German states and keeping the empire fragmented and difficult to control. A major foreign policy win for France. Plus, individual states of the empire could make treaties with each other, and France and Sweden now served as guarantor of the empire's constitution. Meaning, if Frederick tried to pull what his father had by shifting electoral votes, Sweden and France would invade the empire.
And so this is something that, again, that you see throughout history, especially from this point on, where you build into things certain triggers that say, okay, if this happens, this is what's going to happen. If you cross this line, if you make this choice, this army has a right by treaty to march in and take you out. And so, in a sense, this is where you start to get peace treaties that can be enforced and aren't just predicated on the idea, well, I promise to do this, and that's really all the enforcement there is.
And then came the land. That was the stickiest part. Because, as you'll recall, both Catholic and Protestant factions had started rewarding generals and sometimes troops with land. Unsurprisingly, these folks didn't want to give it up. But in the end, secular lands went back to who'd owned them in 1618, and church lands went to whoever owned it in 1624. So, Ferdinand got to keep Bohemia as part of his family lands, even though a Protestant army had just marched into it. But there were territorial changes, mostly favoring the anti-Habsburg faction. Sweden got territory that helped it control the Baltic Sea and major rivers. France got Alsace and areas it had taken a century earlier.
So Alsace and Lorraine are one of those regions that get fought over and change hands between German and French, or Holy Roman Empire in this case, and French, back and forth all the way up to the 20th century.
But were now formally recognized. The Protestant state of Brandenburg got bigger and more powerful, as did the southern Catholic state of Bavaria, which kept the Upper Palatinate.
And Brandenburg becomes the primary piece of what will become Prussia.
The Lower Palatinate? That went back to Frederick V's son. It was a peace that hobbled the possibility of German unification for another 2 centuries, and set Brandenburg, later known as Prussia, and Bavaria on a course to be Germany's dominant power players. The empire's center of rule shifted to Vienna, and with its new territory, France could threaten invasion whenever it wished. But while it's true that the treaty was trying to constrain Habsburg power, one has to be a little careful how you discuss the Peace of Westphalia. Later German nationalists, from Bismarck to the Nazis, would cast the treaty as part of a narrative of victimization. spinning it that the rest of Europe was trying to keep the German nation and its people down. But in reality, no single sense of nationhood or commonality existed at the time. After all, this had been a civil war. And speaking of later interpretations, looking back, Westphalia was also a landmark because it set some precedent for the idea of state sovereignty. The concept that a government controlling a piece of territory should be free to govern that area and its people as it sees fit, without interference from other states.
And that is something that actually gets debated a lot by historians today. This idea of whether or not the Treaty of Westphalia was really the place that you can point to as saying this is where you really start to get the idea of state sovereignty. I tend to believe it is one of the major components to that. It's not the only one, but some people would argue that's not the case.
In fact, the Treaty of Westphalia has often been cited as a step toward the international order we have now, where secular authority supersedes religious power, countries control all within their borders, and diplomacy is conducted via a sole designated official. And not by a horde of nobles that throw someone out a window. Step in the right direction. Now, of course, exactly how big a step it was toward our modern world is still debated by historians. But at the time,
he literally just said everything I said. This is the one problem, and I say this all the time, with me reacting to videos I haven't seen yet, is I don't know they're going to say these things. So, sorry.
One thing was certain. The Peace of Westphalia had stopped one of the most terrible wars Europe would ever witness. And though there would be more conflicts, it would not be until 1914, when a very different Europe, one with Germany, rather than the Holy Roman Empire at its center, would see the Four Horsemen ride again.
And I would argue that you see the Four Horsemen before that, Napoleonic Wars. I mean, very much echoes of the 30 Years' War. So, fascinating stuff. We will look further at the 30 Years' War. I want to look at it from a more military aspect and look at some of the major campaigns and battles. So some of you suggested some videos for me to do that. So thank you for those suggestions. If you are a patron or you'd like to be one, head on over there. There's a new vote up for you to recommend the next thing you'd like to see from me as far as reaction videos go. Be watching for original content in the next day or two, and I'll be back soon with more reactions. Thanks for watching.